Welcome to everybody. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. We got a lot of people logging in, and we'll wait for them to come. Give us a minute. And then quick radio check. Steve, can you hear me?
Yes.
To the production crew, can you hear me? And am I sharing my slides? It looks like I'm sharing my slides. Okay, we're gonna get going today. Thank you to our audience for joining us today to learn about mastering CMMC compliance. We're super excited about this topic. We're very, very devoted to this topic, and I am very pleased to be joined today with my colleague and friend, Steve Rutkovitz. I am Bill Falk, the president go-to-market for Actifile. And Steve, welcome to our webinar. I'd love to hear a little bit of an introduction.
Hi, Bill. How you doing? My name is Steve Rutkovitz. I'm the CEO of Choice Cyber Solutions. We're a pure-play compliance and cybersecurity company. We provide end-to-end services from assessment all the way to full certification. We provide 20+ compliances and privacy frameworks. We are an RPO with the DoD, which is a readiness practitioner organization that helps companies get ready for CMMC compliance. We've worked and now support over 60 DoD contractors and have learned a ton over the last number of years. And we've actually gotten a couple companies already through the certification process. So we have a lot of experience.
Outstanding. Thank you for the introduction. So a little bit of the agenda and housekeeping. We're Actifile is a partner of Choice Cyber and Steve. We're gonna talk about that a little bit. We're gonna talk a lot about Steve's experience and what he sees happening right now in the land of CMMC, both from a contractor standpoint and from a service provider, whether that be an MSP, an MSSP, or some other type of provider into the market. We will shamelessly talk a little bit about Actifile and how it fits in and how it can be used as a tool, an ingredient amongst other tools that are necessary to automate and help with this effort. This is the first of a sequence of events, sequence of seminars or webinars that we will be doing. We'll talk about next step and calls to action as we get through the agenda. So off the top, right at the beginning, Steve, love to hear your take on, in general, like what's happening in the market with CMMC 2.0. Here we are in February following some events from middle December, but where do you see things today in this marketplace?
Well, there's been a lot of changes, as everybody can see in the news every day. With the new president, there's a ton of changes. But the key thing here is that we went from what's called the CMMC interim rule to the CMMC final rule on December 16th of 2024. So just a couple months ago, the final rule went in place, which means that companies that do support for the DoD are going to have a CMMC certification if they have access and store, process, or transmit CUI. And it's going to start popping up in contracts in 2025, and it's going to be in a lot of contracts in 2026. So companies that plan on doing work in the DoD going forward are going to need to have this CMMC compliance. I think the biggest thing that happened this week was Katie Arrington. I don't know how many people in here know Katie Arrington, but I've been working in the DoD contractor space for about 10 years. Katie Arrington was the CEO, the CISO, the CISO, the Chief Security Information Officer for the Pentagon and Defense Department. And she's the one that actually put together and created and created the entire CMMC process. So she actually said it needs to be done. She built it. She put the AB board in place. And when I tell you that she went out there and evangelized it, she actually went to every single webinar and every single focus group and every giant presentation. And she's been pushing the DoD and pushing the CMMC compliance and certification. About 2 years ago, there was some hoopla at the DoD, and she actually wound up getting fired, and she got actually removed from her position. And it wasn't a good time. She was very upset about it. And lo and behold, last week she became the new CISO again of the DoD. So by her coming back in, I can pretty much tell you with some certainty that the CMMC is alive and well. The final rule is in place, and I predict that it's going to be enforced going forward. The second thing that I think is really interesting is I know there's been a lot of uncertainty about government contractors, employees, cuts. But if you really look underneath what all this saying that I'm hearing is that, you know, Pete Hegseth said cybersecurity is not getting cut. So cybersecurity is not getting cut. Then he, on the second hand, said the Navy needs to be positioned and actually upgraded. So the Navy needs a major upgrade in order to compete in the future against some of the threats with China. And just this morning, Donald Trump said we need to upgrade the Air Force and also the Space Force. So I think that there won't be DoD department cuts. I think they'll be shifting some of the monies around. And if you think about it, if they really want to achieve what they want to achieve, you're probably going to have to spend more money. So it's really good for defense contractors. There's going to be short-term uncertainty, right? So some contractors we're speaking to are kind of pausing a little bit. Some see this as an opportunity and going full steam ahead because they want to be right-sized. So when these contracts come out, it's going to be a little bit of investment, but they want to be ready for these contracts. So I personally think that it's full steam ahead, and companies that do spend the money and get the certification and CMMC certification in place will be poised for these contracts coming out. And the other thing is you have to be careful of is you got to be careful what you say and put out there, because there's a couple of false claims acts. I don't know if you saw it or not, that companies were fined for saying that they had cybersecurity compliance postures in place and they didn't. So that's pretty much what's happening right now, Bill, and it's pretty exciting.
Interesting. So you answered a lot there. You talked about a lot. So safe to say that, in your opinion, the new administration and DOGE and whatnot will likely not impact directly CMMC for this audience. In fact, it could continue to elevate the importance of paying attention to these regulations, because, like you said, you can get in trouble if you're out of line.
Okay. A short-term effect, but I think long-term, 2 to 3 months, but I think long-term, it's going to grow.
Thank you. Okay. So there's some terminology, and again, for the audience, we're gonna do our best to, educate based on our perspective what's happening in the market. So lots of acronyms in this. It's a government topic, so lots of acronyms. So one of the ones that I think is very pertinent to this discussion in this group, ESP. What does that stand for? Any changes to this as part of this discussion?
Yeah, this is a big change. The ESP is the external service provider. So it's a category in the CMMC compliance. And usually it affects what I would call managed service providers, MSPs, and MSSPs. We work with over 100 MSPs in the country. And until the final rule came out, so before December 16th of 2024, what it said was that if you were an MSP or an MSSP or a service provider, you had to have a CMMC 2.0 certification in place in order to do support for a company that is getting CMMC 2.0. So in other words, MSPs had to be certified if they want to support companies that have certification 2.0. Now, we know MSPs out there have a lot of clients that are CMMC, but usually it's a couple. I work with 100 and some MSPs, and probably they have 6 or less. So it doesn't really pay for them to spin up and do all the certifications and spend the money for training and whatnot. So actually, when they had the actual hearing, I actually put in a big comment about this, and they actually listened. And what they came back was that MSPs don't have to have a certification to actually support their CMMC 2.0 clients. However, they are part of the audit. So what does that mean? So if a MSP or MSSP is supporting a customer that has a CMMC 2.0 certification or compliance, they're going to be part of the audit. So it's important that they have each one of the controls that they're actually supporting. So for example, if they're doing the backups and they're doing it with Veeam in the cloud, and that's how they're doing it, it has to be showed very clearly and mapped out a matrix of what the client's doing and what the MSP is doing, because the auditor is going to look at that. So in theory, your client could pass the audit, but you fail the shared matrix piece, your customer would fail. So we spend a lot of time not only helping the clients get ready, but helping their external service providers get ready. Now, if an MSP has, let's say, more than 6 clients, then you may make sense to get certified, because all you have to do is show the actual paper or certification. If you are part of the audit, it's going to take some time, right? So it may take 16, 20 hours of your time to show and be part of that audit to produce the evidence to the auditor.
Mm-hmm. So you're touching on an important point. So I think it's safe to say that this market, this segment of the market, is maturing, or it's showing signs of a more mature market. And with that, any other discussion, thoughts on, what does it mean to MSPs or MSSPs that want to be able to serve their customers in this way?
Yeah, I think it's a golden opportunity for MSPs, because I think what's going to happen, especially with Katie Arrington back at the helm of the DoD, I think what you're going to see is that there's 80,000 DoD contractors that have to have CMMC certification of some level, and it's going to also move into the other parts of the government. We're already getting RFP requirements that are marking CMMC in the documents, and the reason I think it's going to be bigger is because that they already have the infrastructure set up. So you have to have, like us, RPOs or readiness companies, you have to have the auditors, and this infrastructure is kind of built so they can start moving it out vertically. So that's where I see kind of the next thing. So for MSPs, it's good to have this services and additional services for the existing customers, but it'll help them build that new logo business as well when they're out there talking to companies, manufacturers, and software companies that are going to be doing government contracts long term.
Okay, and we're going to come back to this thread in a bit, but I also want to come back to some of the things that you see that may have changed. So FedRAMP, where any specific changes relevant to this audience around FedRAMP?
Yeah, so we talk about the controls the client has to have in place, and we'll get there a little bit more. Then whoever's the ESP or the service provider, they have to show the shared matrix. But the next phase that has to show the actual shared matrix are the actual software services that you use. So these software services that store, transmit, or process CUI have to be FedRAMP compliant. Now, FedRAMP has 2 different kinds of compliances. There's a FedRAMP authorized, where you have to have what's called an ATO, which means you have to have somebody that's kind of sponsors you and brings you in through the DoD space. So let's say you have a software program that somebody really likes the Navy. You have to find a Navy sponsor to take you through the process. The problem is that it's so slow. I've seen companies waiting for ATO certifications for 3 and 4 years. So it just didn't work, because it was kind of, companies were bottling up. So what they came out with is something called FedRAMP equivalent. FedRAMP equivalent is having the NIST 853 controls in place, and having those in place, and then you have to prove that those controls are in place in the shared matrix. There's also a certification process in there as well. So when we do our risk assessments, we have to map out the CUI, understand where it's going, then identify what company's software it has to be FedRAMP compliant, and we have to figure out if it's authorized or equivalent. There's more work to do if it's equivalent. You have to show a shared matrix. With authorized, you just got to show the certification. And then the other piece of software is, which we get asked a lot of times, is what about like a RIM tool that's doing the patching? What about the backups? What about other software like your firewall? They're called security protection assets. And the security protection assets fall under what's called a different category and don't have to be FedRAMP compliant unless they have CUI, which most of these products don't do. So I hope that's helpful as well.
It's very, very, very helpful. And then back to the, what does it mean to the audience, whether you're a contractor or an MSP? Let's talk about how a company, again, whether you're a contractor or an MSP, are there developing best practices or recommendations that you have for preparedness?
Yeah, so we have a very repeatable process. One of the things that's so important in cybersecurity is something that's very, very repeatable. We have a process called assess, address, and maintain. And we now have a worldwide service mark on it. So in the assessment, you've got to really do a deep dive and understand exactly the baseline of where a company is right now against the NIST 110 controls. But it takes it a step further. There's 110 controls and there's 320 assessment objectives. So think about, control one might have an A, B, and C. So really you have 320 assessment objectives. That's why it makes it so difficult to get this done, because once you identify that, you have to have a piece of evidence. We also run a series of scans that we have to run like Actifile. And I'll explain more about that, but we have to understand the CUI, we have to understand the FCI, who's using it. We have to get a really clear picture of exactly how the data flows. Then we need to know vulnerability scans. We have to do interviews. We have to do phishing testing. So risk assessment is pretty comprehensive. Then once we build the risk assessment, then we have to come back and figure out the plan. And sometimes it takes redesign of certain things or replacement of products. And once we figure out where we're going, kind of the future state from the current state, then we can build the SSP. The SSP is your system security plan. The system security plan is an enormous document. It can be several hundred pages long, and that acts as the scoping document. So the question is, and I'll get a little deeper, is how do you scope? And we'll explain that. But then once you have your SSP, that's all the controls and how you're going to implement them. And the POAM are the missing controls, the things that are missing. Then you have to put a plan of how you're going to implement those controls with dates and milestones and times. And then you have to get your score uploaded. So the score goes up to the SPRS website. And again, you got to be careful because you can fall under false claims if that score is not right. And if it's too low, I would think that a contract officer may hold that against you. So we want to get the assessment and kind of build the SSP and POAM and show kind of a B plus, C minus, C plus, B minus average to show that you got most of the things in place, but it's missing. So that's kind of the process that we do to start with the assessment. Then we build out and implement the controls. Then we have to maintain it over time.
Outstanding. And so just for the audience, just a reminder that if you have questions, please post them. And as mentioned later on here, we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can during this session. Okay, so we shift a little bit to, let's talk a little bit about something, more tangible. We'll talk a little bit about how Actifile is as a tool and ingredient in your stack. So there's a couple of screenshots that we can use starting off here. What's the
first question,
what is this all about?
Yeah, the first question I always get from everybody is, what level am I? Because if you're level 2, you normally need a certification, and it's a lot of work. You got to make sure the certification is a much higher bar. If I'm a level 1, then I could do a self-assessment and I don't have to get a certification. So people all the time ask me, what level I am, right? And people just aren't really sure what level they are. The second thing I get all the time is, can I build an enclave? So an enclave is a subset of users. So they might have 125 employees, and they say only 10 people in the company ever touch CUI. So the level and the enclave are the first things that everybody asks. And usually, most companies that don't have the right tools, they say, what level are you? And the customer says, I'm level 1. And they don't know, right? Or they're level 2 and they're just guessing. And the reason they're guessing is because these documents that are marked with CUI are coming from the DoD, and they're coming from the contract officer, and the user's not marking them. So, and then you go into the system and nobody's really watching what documents are marked. So you really don't know. Then the enclave is, people tell me all the time, only 10 people are using out of 150 or 200 people. Can we just do an enclave? And the answer is that's a guess too, because nobody knows who's really using CUI and doesn't have a real good handle. So what we do is we load Actifile. And what Actifile does a really good job of doing is showing us that's the data at rest in motion. And what we've done with Actifile is we worked for a while and we got all the different types of CUI data scanning inside of Actifile. So what happens now is we've taken the guesswork away. We'll interview people and we'll get what they think it is. And then the Actifile will tell us exactly. So if we put the scanner in place, like in this case, we can see by device, by actual machine. If you look to the right, PII would be personal identifiable information. PCI would be if it's PCI compliance. But there you go, CMMC. So that's all the different types of CUI, and we can break that down. And then what happens, now we can start looking and clearly to see what users send and receive markings of CUI documents. So if we see it on a lot of documents, then it may make sense to actually get the whole company certified. If we don't see it on a lot of documents and we do see a subset, then we can put it in an enclave, right? And of maybe 10 users. And then once you know that, then you can really start figuring out how to build an SSP and maybe even save a bunch of money if you could use products like a Prevail or Box that are designed to do enclaves, and you don't have to get the full-blown Microsoft, let's say GCC high. So I'm always asking what level. I'm always asking, do you think you could do an enclave? And I'm always asking, do you have ITAR? Because ITAR puts it in a whole different realm as well. Once we know those three things, we do the scan. This shows us by device who has CUI and who doesn't. And Bill, you may want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
And the next slide shows the data in motion. So now I can see in motion where the CUI is actually going and coming. So if I see CUI going to different cloud solutions, then remember we got to get some kind of FedRAMP compliancy on there, or we have to change it, right? So I see sometimes people moving CUI to Google Docs, and it's not even part of the corporate environment. So we can see kind of shadow IT, learn, kind of run this for a couple of weeks, and it gives us really good insight as to the level, the enclave possibility, whether we have ITAR docs, and which software actually is touching, which applications are touching CUI, and then we can see if they need to be FedRAMP compliant or not. So by getting that information and not guessing at it really helps us in the first step, which is the assessment and scoping of the actual audit. Because remember, I talked about scoping now becomes your SSP, and that becomes part of the audit. So if we can get an enclave, the audit is reduced, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Okay, so then without turning this into a demo, like the previous slide this is a view of answering the question that no one can really answer, which is, where is all my data? They may think it's in their enclave, or it's maybe only on a subset, but until you do an assessment using a tool like Actifile, you don't really know. And then with that in this page, you're able to see how the data is being used, who's touching it, where is it coming from, where is it going, who's sharing it, is it being copied onto someone's thumb drive, those kinds of things provide a whole other level of information.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
when you did the self-assessments last year, people could tell you what they thought, and it didn't really matter. You could do a self-assessment. But you have to realize is you've got to know this now, because now you're getting held to a higher standard. You're going to hire a third-party CMMC auditor that are really rigorous guys are going to come in, and guess what? You're going to have to prove it. So if you say you have an enclave, you can't just have an enclave, you've got to prove it. So then that's the next place we use Actifile is in the discovery. Then we keep it around for a while to let the auditor kind of see and print reports and show them that these 10 users are using it, but these 90 users aren't. And we are able to prove that we have an enclave. So that's going to be very important for the auditor.
Okay. And then a couple other definitions that come to mind. Actually, even I'm using these words as if everybody understands them. But we talk about assessment, and then we talk about audit. Are those synonymous, or is one part of the other? Please explain those definitions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I shouldn't use the word audit. So I do a lot of audits in other areas. We have a lot of experience doing ISO 27001 audits. We do a lot of SOC audits. But for some reason, they didn't want to use the word audit. So they call it an assessor, and it's an assessment. But that's what the AD board has called it. So to understand how the AD board was set up, what they did was they took something called the ISO 17011. That is a ISO framework for certification bodies. And they built it, and as long as you follow all the components, like a separate readiness company and a separate auditor, so you can't have the Fox watch in in-house, and kind of a place to complain and a 3-year audit. As long as you follow all those rules, you basically are building your own assessment body. So instead of calling it an audit, they just called it an assessment, and the assessors do the assessment. And the 3CPAO is the company that actually is the overarching watch body of these assessors.
Terrific. And with that in mind, how, again, are there recommendations, best practices? How do you prepare, not necessarily for an audit, but for an assessment? And you know, the follow-on questions here on the screen: is there a gauge? Does size of a company dictate cost? Is it service levels? Again, so preparedness, and then a little bit about the cost factors.
So we've seen companies come in like one of 4 categories. Either, you know what, I really haven't done much, I've been waiting, and now that we have to do it, I'm going to do it, and they have 0 in place or very little. And again, they usually say, I have nothing in place. Sometimes that's good, because then we can just hit the ground running and just build the policies, procedures, do the assessment really quickly. But the first type of companies I see are just don't have anything in place. So we got to take them all the way from an assessment, all the way to implementation, all the way through the audit, and we'll handhold them through the audit, and we'll even shop out the auditors. The second I see may have 25 to 50% in place. They've done some work, they put it on pause or whatever, and we got to come in, get up to speed very quickly on what they have, and then take them across the finish line. The third probably has 75% in place, but they don't have the last 25% in place, and then we can pick up and just move them forward. And then we have some clients that say they're 95% complete, and they're ready for an audit. And I can tell you, I've looked at 3 or 4 of them, and they're just not ready for an audit. They're ready for a self-assessment, but the audit is really rigorous, and that the SSP has to be, several hundred pages because of all the different evidence. So the auditor is going to look at a piece of evidence for every single control. It has to be current. And sometimes they ask for it on the fly. So you have to be ready. So we help the customer all the way through to the assessment, and we actually are there running interference and answering questions and whatnot to make sure he gets the right information. The audit processes and costs. This is interesting because I have so much experience in other audits. The more ready the work is and the more easy you make it for the auditor, we have been pretty good at crushing the audit costs. So I just had a client that we just we shopped 3 prices, and make sure you shop 3 prices for auditors. You want somebody that's kind of local. If not, they're charging for travel expenses because they have to come on site. And you want an auditor that's done this before. They're not learning and charging extra hours. But I just had a situation where the client did a shopping on their own. They got an audit price for about 40 users of $62,000. And then I shopped 2 other prices, got one for 40, one for 30. So that's more than 50% difference. So understanding how to have these conversations and almost negotiating with these auditors the right pricing and the right scope is important. Now, remember, if you're able to get an enclave, and which is a subset, the costs will even go lower. So we have a lot of experience helping companies get this all right from the start. And then when they get to the audit, we want to make sure that the audit costs are the least. And then you want to have really good tools like Actifile. So if you do have an enclave, we can prove in a matter of seconds that there is an enclave and the auditor is not, fishing and making us prove for a couple of days that we really have an enclave. So the tools are also important as well. Is that helpful, Bill?
Very much. And then you triggered a follow-on thought. So you use the word self-assessment. So self-assessment versus mandatory, I think, is the
proper so before December 16th, everybody had to do a self-assessment, whether you're level 1 or level 2. Level 3 is coming, but there's no real rules for certifications on level 3. You have to do, instead of a NIST 172, you have to 71. You have to do a NIST 172 with additional controls, and there will be a certification process out for that. I understand in 2026, and that's for more sensitive data, and it falls into different categories. But until December 16th, all you had to do was do a self-assessment, an SSP, POAM, and score, and register it. So level 1 had to have an assessment, and there's 17 controls. Level 2 had to have 110 controls, SSP, POAM, and score. Now with the final rule, if companies have CUI and they're going to need a level 2, they'll have to have a certification. That's kind of the second step. And the reason is, if you talk to Katie Arrington, you really can't trust everybody with a self-assessment. The only way you can really trust everybody is if they have this third-party audit that's really rigorous. And that's what they do.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a progression going on here, oversimplifying it, but self-assessment leading to something that's more defined, the exposure, the potential for penalties and so forth seems to be taking a tick up, so that the market should be paying closer attention. And then we can move on from this, but things like conditional certifications and process for filling gaps. So if you do an assessment and you fail or there's gaps, how does that all?
Yeah, that's kind of a pretty high bar as well. So if you go into an assessment, and let's say it costs you 30 grand, and you go all the way through this process and you don't get an 80% or better. And remember, the auditor is not your friend. He can't tell you anything. It's like taking a standardized test with a proctor in the front. It's either yes or no. He'll ask for evidence and it's yes or no. He can't help you at all. If you don't get an 80% or better, guess what? You fail, and you've got to do it all over again and pay a second assessment fee. So that's why it's important to work with companies like us. I pretty much can guarantee we'll get it done the first time because of our experience and knowing how to do this. The other thing is, let's say you do get like a 85, but there's a lot of things that need to be put in place. A SIM, you may have to have 2-factor authentication. The training wasn't done. I don't know exactly what those controls would be, but you have to have them back in place within 90 days, and that auditor can charge you extra to come back and review it. if he wants to. And then at that point, it has to be done. So there, you need to get at least an 80% just to get the list of remediations in 90 days to fix them. If you get it under 80%, you got to do it over again, and that's not going to be comfortable. Have to pay for that twice.
Okay. And then we're getting down through this, and Steve, thank you for your great wisdom and patience with all the questions. I got a couple more, and then we'll move into Q&A. So if any thoughts on like sort of shifting past like preparedness and assessments and so forth, if there's a breach, God forbid, what happens then? Like what does Choice do? Are you involved in that? How can a tool like Actifile help with post-breach?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the third thing we use Actifile for is we have, I said, assess, address, and maintain. So we have what's called like a surveillance and maintenance program, which is like regular check-ins. We help with tabletop exercises and the annual assessments. Remember, the audit's a 3-year audit, but you have to have an annual assessment, which is a risk assessment. And there's things you have to do over time so it doesn't like unravel, fall apart. So we have a very good low-cost kind of continuous compliance plan over time. Now, part of what we do and what the whole thing's about is if your company has a breach, anytime along the way, there's very strict rules that are in your incident response plan and have to be written out. And we write all these policies that they have to be notified within 72 hours. I mean, 72 hours is a couple of days, man. You got to get this in pretty quickly. But the question is, most people don't even know if they had a breach or data leaked, right? They don't really know what they're dealing with. You think you had a breach, somebody left a laptop in a car with CUI, you just don't know. With Actifile, because it's kind of watching the data, what I can do very quickly is go in by user, by date, by application, and I can see what data was uploaded or downloaded with precision in a matter of minutes. So if the data, let's say, was encrypted, or the data didn't leak, or only 3 pieces of data went out and it wasn't CUI, I don't have to notify the DoD. It's an event. But if CUI got out and it's unencrypted, guess what? We have to notify, but then we have the evidence. We can print out a report from Actifile and show them only 3 pieces of documentation got out. If you send in you had a breach and you think a lot of information got out, you know that you're going to get some kind of investigation. So the Actifile is really important in any type of compliance to be able to prove or disprove if something got out or leaked or had a breach or an event. So remember, everything that happens isn't a breach. There's a lot of events that happen, and it's up to us to make sure we're protecting you. So we have to decipher whether it's an event or a breach. And the Actifile will give us specific information very quickly that we can zero in on exactly what happened, kind of like it's triage.
Mm-hmm. So the moral of that story is you got to know what's going on with your data. Otherwise, you're really flying blind.
And I'll tell you, you don't know when those calls are coming. So all the things we do with Actifile, I think that's not really promoted the most. But as a person that does the surveillance and maintenance and kind of becomes like the compliance officer, that's the most important thing, because I got to be able to very quickly, in a matter of seconds, be able to assess a situation, whether it's an event or a breach, or if data leaked, it didn't leak, and I have the tools right there, and I'm not guessing. And I think it's very important.
Great. Okay, and as promised, we're gonna segue into Q&A, but before we go there, to get the juices flowing, are there any like nuggets of information, little known facts, and so forth that you've come across in your experience with this topic?
Well, I think the biggest nugget is that, you know, the audit's going to be expensive, but it's very negotiable. So, you know, auditor's going to show up and say it's, you know, it's $62,000. Get a couple prices. Don't just take that first price. And if you can upfront do enclaves and can reduce that scope, you know, it all matters, right? So at the end of the day, we want to keep the cost down. You know, the problem with this whole compliance, it's not really, it's 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives, whether you're 10 users, 25 users, or 25,000 users. And that's pretty much the challenge. So we want to make sure that we help companies crush their costs of having to provide this certification, because it can get expensive. And, that's really a key thing to the whole thing, I think. So that's really, I think, the most important thing.
Okay. Okay. So there are some questions. I think we may have answered this one, but how often will we need a third-party assessor to come back in after we pass the assessment audit? So that's after a pass versus after
yeah. So if you get certified, it's a 3-year audit because it's following the ISO standards, but it's an annual attestation. You got to turn in an annual attestation. So when you look at the SPRS website now, it used to say, what is your score? What is your POAM date that all the POAM pieces are going to be in place? And it also asks for your CMMC certification date. So they're going to be tracking it. So that's important. The other thing to remember is the POAM is for the missing controls. Once you go to a certification, the POAM, it goes bye-bye. Like, you have to have all the controls in place. Right now, there's a little bit of wiggle room to have a POAM of things you're working on. But once the CMMC is in the contract, you'll have to have the POAM goes bye-bye.
Okay.
And again, you can bid on contracts without a CMMC certification, but you can't get awarded them without it. So that's something to remember as well. So usually, we'll see the indication of when you need it. So, we can kind of go slow, get everything ready. And then if we see you're bidding on something, then we want to fast forward the audit. So sometimes people are rushing to get the audit done, but maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, depending on your budget.
Okay. And another question for you, Steve. What other tools, what other tools are you using to perform this good work?
Well, we have a whole stack of tools. So, you have to look at everybody's tools. So if we work with a company with an in-house IT department, I got to learn their stack of tools that they're using, and then look for whatever tools that are missing. Sometimes they have them, sometimes they don't. When I work with an MSP, the first thing we do is we onboard them and we learn their stack. So what I find is tools like, you need a good SIM, auditing and logging, because there's 5 or 6 controls around auditing and logging, and that could be 15 points, right? So if you don't have a good auditing and logging program, then you can have points. Vulnerability scanning is more important than ever, because we got to know the vulnerabilities of these software programs, because if even if a ransomware gets in or something and the vulnerabilities patch, it can't launch, right? So we use products like Qualys. That's what we use for our vulnerability scanning, but there's a lot of them out there. So we use Lumify for our SIM. So we use some of these really good technologies to actually really do a deep dive and get a clear understanding of the risk. The better you get an assessment, better baseline, the better you not only get a customer compliant, but you also protect them. So compliance is checking the boxes. I got to take it a step further and make sure they're protected.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we're gonna, let's see. Here we have one more question. What other tools?
I see how long it takes. That's a good one.
Are there any circumstances under which a self-assessment is possible for level 2?
So the answer is yes. So, this thing called CUI. If you ever go in the archives and look up CUI, it's like 100 different categories. So the DoD at some point's got to do a better job of defining what's really important CUI. So, but right now it's everything, and that's a little bit of a problem, and that's why most companies are falling in level 2, and very few, if any, fall into level 1, because it just says CUI. Now, there are some carve-outs for some types of CUI that will pass a level 2 that doesn't need a certification. So that's why we need to scan for the CUI and then drill down a little bit and see what kind of CUI you have. So it's possible that using the Actifile, we can scan for the CUI, then look at the actual files, and if it falls under the NARA, carve-outs, then they wouldn't have to have a level 2. But it's kind of rare. Most defense contractor documents, drawings, etc., that are marked fall under level 2 certification.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Okay. So as mentioned at the top, this is one in a sequence of events that we're hosting. The QR code on the screen here will get you the details to sign up for our deep dive technical review of Actifile next week, hosted by our good friend James Oliverio. So we teased out here today some of the product pages and features and so forth. Next week will be a deep dive. It'll be, I think, a very, very good use of time. And then subsequent to that, we haven't established the date yet, but sometime in March, we're going to be back together with Steve to go through an even deeper presentation of the types of services that Choice Cyber is offering to their clientele, and just another.
And one of the things we're offering, Bill, I mean, if somebody's not sure where they're at in the process, or as a client that needs help, we'll absolutely do a discovery call at no choice. And just from a discovery call, we can say, look, you think you're ready for a certification, but maybe you're not, or maybe you are, or maybe your scope's off, and maybe you should look at this or look at that. So we'll be happy to do a discovery call at no charge as a first step, just to see and kind of give some basic guidance of where they're at. Because the last thing you want to do is go into an audit if you're not ready. That is what I think a lot of companies thought they were ready for. And I've looked at 2 or 3 of them that have come to us. And I said, you know, your SSP is 50 pages. It needs to be like 200, right? The level of evidence that these auditors are looking for is, I would call, enormous. And I've never seen it in any other compliance arena, in the SOC and the ISO, but the level here is a 10x compared to ISO and SOC. So just want to warn everybody that it's really, you know, we've already seen it and been through it, and we didn't know it the first time either, just to let you know.
Safe to say it's not for the faint of heart. It is a very important undertaking for the contractor and the MSP, and hopefully today during this session you've learned some things to help you along the way. I want to give my thanks to Steve for once again providing all this wisdom and entertainment to the audience, and we look forward to talking further. And there'll be follow-up from this, giving everybody an opportunity to come directly with further questions or inquiries about either Choice or Actifile, and then hope to see you at a subsequent event. Thanks again, Steve.
Great, Bill. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, today for joining the webinar, and hope to talk to you or see you later. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
You got it.